Ready whenever you are, Chair.
Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone has been admitted to the call. I'm not sure any more are due to join us. I can't see the entire list, but I'm sure you're all here. Well, thank you for all coming along today to discuss matters. Welcome to all attendees. Before I hand over to Mary, can I issue my usual plea, which is an odd one given how illiterate I am with technology, that if you are going to attend, can I encourage you to tweet using hashtag APPG on CP, if that makes sense. And also just remind you that the call for evidence on this inquiry into transitioning into adulthood with cerebral palsy, the evidence session is open until the 15th of July. As you may have already heard, please keep your cameras on. It really helps us to do the question and answer session when the time comes, but your microphones are to be muted. I want to hear nothing in the background, no workmen, no mewling cats, no backfiring engines or anything like that. If you wish to ask a question, you have two choices: either raise your hand in the message or message in the chat, and both will be monitored for that purpose. And then the meeting, as you just saw, is being recorded and will be available on Zoom. And I'm going to hand over to Mary, who is going to set the scene, as it says on my notes. So Mary, set the scene, please.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And it's a pleasure to be chairing our first hybrid meeting with you and with our audience. And this is the second of our evidence sessions that are looking at the transition to adulthood for those living with cerebral palsy and their families. And the work of our APPG focuses on examining the impact of cerebral palsy as a lifelong condition. And it's hard to think of a more crucial phase than the formative years between childhood and adulthood. And in any life, these are the years that have some of the most profound impacts on the direction in our life. And for those living with cerebral palsy, they are very fraught and uncertain around any availability of support. Our previous report on healthcare and employment highlighted that many of those living with cerebral palsy have experienced patchy access to service provision that's necessary for them to live a full life, even in childhood. But even for those who've enjoyed access of wraparound care, very often they then experience this cliff edge when they reach the age of 18. And no one should have to live a life with that additional anxiety alongside trying to manage their lifelong condition like cerebral palsy. Our fourth report is looking at this vital phase and seeking to explore how so many people in the world, in the cerebral palsy community, manage to fall through the cracks. We've already heard compelling testimonies on lived experience. So in this session, we're moving to focus on the role of health and the education system in the transition to adulthood. And I'm delighted to welcome the Minister here today. She'll be here shortly to address this important issue. Throughout our work today, the APPG has enjoyed a productive and constructive relationship with her department and the government. And her attendance today is a sign of how seriously ministers are taking our work and those of the wider cerebral palsy community. Joining her on the panel is James Melville-Ross, a parent who'll be speaking about his experience of caring for his twins. Welcome to you, James. Alex Stafford is a member of the legal team for IPSEA, who offer vital training to those with SEND on post-16 education and other areas. And finally, we have Mrunal Sisodia is co-chair of a national network of parent carers forums and a powerful advocate in this space. So before we get underway, I'd like to invite Ben Sutcliffe from Caudwell children, who are kindly co-sponsoring our work this year with Action Cerebral Palsy. And he's just going to say a few words about his organisation. So I'll hand straight over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Mary, and I won't keep you long because we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers today. But I just wanted to firstly say how proud Caudwell children are to co-sponsor this alongside our friends at Action Cerebral Palsy, and to also pass on the apologies of our founder, John Caudwell, and our chief exec, Trudy Beswick, who were unable to attend today. They're actually somewhere in the building filming for a documentary about philanthropy, so hopefully highlighting the cause even further. Caudwell Children is a national pan-disability charity that's been running for 22 years, and in that time we've helped nearly 70,000 children. And after autism, cerebral palsy is our second most prevalent condition with the children and families that we help. We are passionate about improving the health and well-being of all disabled children, and we want to work with experts by experience and collaborate with other organisations to ensure that they get the best possible start in life and then transition to a comfortable and fulfilling adulthood. So these meetings and this round of APPGs are extremely important to us as we support the cerebral palsy community now and in the future to make sure that they get the best possible care moving forward. I will leave it at that, and we can move on to the great line of speakers, especially our expert by experience, because families and children drive this charity and determine how we shape our services. So listening to the people who live this day to day are of extreme importance. So thank you everybody for attending, and thank you to all of our speakers today.
Thank you very much indeed, Ben, and thank you to John and Trudy as well, who I know joined us at our reception here in the House of Commons a couple of months ago now, and for all Caudwell is doing to support the work of the APPG. It really is appreciated. You rightly pointed out that we need to listen to people with lived experience. So in the absence of the Minister for the next 6 minutes, we're going to slightly leap down our agenda, and I will ask James Melville-Ross to make his contribution. James is an ambassador for Scope, but perhaps far more importantly than that, he is the parent of Tommy and Alice, 2 teenagers with cerebral palsy, who I think is very well placed to talk about the transition to adulthood. That's something he's going through at the moment. So James, if you can, I can certainly see you all, but if you can hear me, would you like to start talking, please?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Mary. And thank you, everybody, for letting me come and tell our story. This is our family. As you can see, misery is quite a long way away from the normal daily agenda for us. But if I can start by just doing a bit of our backstory, really, just to fill you in on where the twins have come from, because I think it's important in understanding where we are now as they reach the age of 18 and we go through transition. The next slide, please, Mike. So this is Alice, I think, aged a month old. Our twins were born very prematurely. They were 24 weeks when they arrived, so they were 4 months premature. They weighed 1.5 pounds, the size of my hand, and they were given a 20% chance of surviving. We had heart attacks, we had collapsed lungs, we had brain operations, we had hospital superbugs, full 9 yards. But they survived, and after 9 months in intensive care, they came home to, you can imagine, enormous celebration. Sadly, the celebration was slightly short-lived. We soon afterwards had the diagnosis of severe quadriplegic cerebral palsy, allied to that severe dystonia, which is a condition, a neurological condition, which means that the body, the brain is instructing the body to go into uncontrollable spasms. They're doubly incontinent, they're tube-fed. Tommy is profoundly deaf, and he has seizures as well. They're in wheelchairs, they have no hand control and very little in the way of speech. So they're entirely reliant on adult support for every aspect of daily living. We have the next slide, please, Mike. Thank you. So yeah, everything has to be done for them: dressing, feeding, toileting, changing. They have meds every hour, they have 24-hour support, and they have one-to-one care at night time, 2-to-1 care during the day. Everything is a battle for us as parents in terms of EHC plans, primary school, secondary school. Everything's been a real fight. as Amanda Richardson on the panel will remember only too well. But that's nothing compared to the battle that they've had through their lives, living with this constant pain, the brain surgery, double hip replacements, long spells in intensive care, and so on. For all of that, as you can see from this photograph, the twins relish life. They laugh every day. They love being amongst friends and family. They have canoed, they have surfed, they have skied, they have ridden horses, and they've even climbed a mountain, albeit with a bit of help. Sometimes our son Tommy is able to control his body sufficiently to be able to power a powered wheelchair. Our flabbeds have never recovered from that. And sometimes our daughter Alice is able to get her body under sufficient control to be able to say a few words. She used a word to describe her dad the other day, 4 syllables. It was very impressive. The word was incompetent, but you can't have it all. So next slide, please, Mike. Here we are. This is the situation as we have it today. They're now adults, 18 last summer. After those inauspicious beginnings, you can imagine that the 18th birthday was cause for significant celebration, as is every birthday, really. Unfortunately, when they leave school, all of the support that they've had simply evaporates. At school, they've had long, fulfilling days, 9 to 5 lessons, all the therapies they need, speech and language therapy, physiotherapy, social events, sports, you name it. And they're surrounded by friends. Trelaws, which is their current school, has 180 children at it, 700 staff, so it's a very active environment, as you can imagine. And afterwards, just nothing. As Mary said, it's a cliff edge of support, really, moving from children's services to adult services. And it's yet another fight for all of us. The provision of social care and health to a certain extent is very patchy, as Mary said, and very inconsistent. Transitions between services are very tough. There's a lack of information, advice, and support for young people like these two and our family. And there's a lack of meaningful ongoing physiotherapy, which is so crucial, not just really to their able to do certain things, but also to be able to function at all. So really, we need 3 things at this stage as they look to leave college in the next few years. We need a place where they can live, where their complex needs are met. We need, secondly, activities, to keep them busy and to be with friends to satisfy their social requirements. We need, thirdly, therapies, as I mentioned. And finally, we need a job for them, something to give them purpose, something to fulfill them through the day. And unfortunately, that's really not possible to find in one place. So the options really for us at this stage are they come home to live with us for the rest of their lives. During 6 months of lockdown, they made it very apparent that that wasn't the situation they were particularly happy about sustaining for any length of time. So that's off the table. They go away to a specialist provision, half a day away. That's not something that we think that we want. We want them to be close to us. And those specialist provisions are well set up to cater for autism, but not well set up to cater for cerebral palsy. Or they end up in a care home for the elderly, which age 21 is something which we find absolutely desperate, given you can see how much they enjoy being surrounded by people of their age. So the only option for us is to build a site. We're working at the moment to build a site for 10 to 15 young adults with complex needs in Aylesbury in order to fulfil that unmet need. But it's something which requires a huge amount of work. It really shouldn't be necessary that it should fall on our shoulders. But we just don't see the support that we need for our kids at this critical juncture. So in terms of tasks, I guess, the key aspect for us, a joined up national adult CP service to deal with the lack of coordination between education, health and social care, to commission dedicated specialist services based on the needs of local population, and also, really critical at this time, and I'm sure you've all heard this before, is to fix social care. It's in a really desperate state at the moment and needs urgent attention. Final word then, just to say 17% of the UK population have a disability, and we need to stop treating this issue like a minority sport. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, James. Now, I'm trying to work out whether the minister has appeared yet. Is someone is
Minister?
Oh, sorry.
I'm before you.
You're there. I was texting you first. Are you there yet? Are you there yet? That just shows. Excellent. Right.
We haven't missed it. That's good. Okay, bye.
Bye. Now, delighted to be joined by the Minister for Care and Mental Health, Gillian Keegan, also the MP for Chichester. I would describe it as a rising star of the government, but that's normally the kiss of death, so I won't. Other than to say I hold her in the highest regard, because I think she does a fantastic job. So I know that she is in listening mode today as much as anything, but I really hope that she will be able to make some pertinent comments that I'm sure we can all recognise and engage with. So enough of me telling you how wonderful she is. Maybe Gillian, if you would like to kick off and make a few comments, please.
Thanks so much, and thank you so much for inviting me, Paul. And I'm very happy to follow. Paul, is it?
James.
James, sorry, because I completely agree. We do need to fix adult social care, and it's obviously something that's very much at the front of my agenda. And the only time, or the only thing I think when I'm trying to take on this enormous challenge and task is why didn't we start it many years ago? But of course, we all know how difficult reform is across the whole country. But I'd like to begin by thanking the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Cerebral Palsy for inviting me to speak today. It's a great opportunity for me to get to meet some of you and also to learn more as well, and obviously understand the vital work that you undertake to champion the needs of those with cerebral palsy and their families and their carers. I'd also like to extend my thanks to the other speakers, including parents and carers. It is very important to hear how it really feels. I very much appreciate that, you know, here in these atmospheres, obviously, it's very different from what happens at home, what happens in school, what happens in health settings. And I really look forward to hearing about those experiences and any insight that you can offer. The government recognises that the transition to adulthood for young people with cerebral palsy can be particularly difficult, and we're committed to ensuring that young people with this condition receive adequate support and guidance, both within the health and education systems as they navigate the transition. The vast majority of health services for young people with cerebral palsy are commissioned locally by clinical commissioning groups, soon to be ICBs, with local authorities having the equivalent responsibilities for commissioning appropriate social care services. Funding for children's services is generally non-ring-fence and is part of either the wider local government finance settlement or the clinical commissioning group allocation. And this recognises that local authorities and clinical commissioning groups are best placed to decide how they meet their needs, and ensures that they have the freedom and the flexibility to make spending decisions based on the local needs and priorities, including for all young people. But whilst local authorities and CCGs already regularly liaise to plan and commission the most appropriate arrangements for children transitioning from children's services to adult services, there's no doubt that the development of integrated care systems, which will due to be legally and operationally established on the 1st of July, will create new partnerships between the organisations that meet health and care needs across an area and ensure more collaborative and joined up working. And no matter where I go, no matter what group I talk to, pretty much a constant theme is how many people you have to tell the same story to, how many times as you go between services and are sent between various parts of the service. And we hope that the integrated care systems will enable commissioners to coordinate those services much better and to plan it in a way that improves population health overall, as well as reducing the variability in service provision between different areas. As set out in the long-term plan, NHS England's ambitious that by 2028, no child or young person will be lost in the gaps between any children's and adult services, and that their experience of moving between the services is safe, well planned and prepared, so they feel supported and empowered to make decisions about their health and social care needs. And the Department of Health and Social Care is working closely with NHS England to support this work. And the Children and Young People's Transformation Programme, as a promising title, I think, has developed a national framework for transition, which includes the key principles of a 0 to 25-year-old model of care. And a transition skills and capabilities framework has also been developed, which sets out the skills and knowledge that the healthcare workforce needs to deliver high quality, compassionate, personalised care, setting out the standards for transition, education and for training the workforce. And I'm pleased to say that there is specific guidance that's already in place to support commissioners in developing clear pathways for the transition of young people with cerebral palsy into adulthood. And the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence Guidelines, cerebral palsy in under 25s assessment and management covers diagnosing, assessment and managing cerebral palsy in children and young people from birth up to their 25th birthday. The guideline contains key recommendations on transition planning for young people with cerebral palsy, and it includes providing a named worker to facilitate timely and effective transition, as well as involvement from other appropriate professionals such as the patient's GP and named paediatricians and clinicians in adult services. And health authorities have a statutory obligation to take this guidance into account, and the government expects them to consider this guidance when planning the provision of services for those with cerebral palsy. But we do know, however, that the transition to adulthood is not just about health and care services, and it's vital that other services in the wider public sector can appropriately support young people. For example, the Special Education and Disabilities Code of Practice developed by the Department for Education is clear that all children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, including those with cerebral palsy, should be prepared for adulthood, and all local authorities must set out the support available to help children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities move into adulthood as part of their local offer. We know how vital it is that young people with special educational needs and disabilities are listened to regarding the planning of this support, which is why this should be co-produced with children, young people and their families to ensure that it does meet their local needs. And the government expects activities to support effective preparation for adulthood to be embedded within provision across every age and every stage, starting as early as possible. Through the Department for Education, we're also providing funding of £6.1 million for this financial year to strengthen the participation of parents and young people in the special education needs and disabilities system. And this will ensure that children and young people have a voice in designing those policies and services and have access to high quality information, advice and support. We also recognise that although many young people with cerebral palsy can and want to work, they face unnecessary barriers in accessing employment, and we are determined to help disabled people and people with health conditions to get in, stay in and thrive in the workplace, enabling everybody to live healthier and more independent lives. We know this is an important part of our lives. So over the next 3 years, the government will invest £1.3 billion in employment support for disabled people and people with health conditions. And there are currently a range of various initiatives supporting people with health conditions to live independent lives and start and succeed in work. These include work and health programs, the intensive personalised employment support programme, the Access to Work scheme, and the Disability Confident Employee scheme, and support in partnership with the health system, including employment advisors now who we have in the NHS, improving access to psychological therapy services, so to help people get ready and prepared for work. We're also supporting, the Department for Education is also supporting the Department of Work and Pensions to develop an adjustment passport, and that will help ensure a smooth transition into employment for people with special needs and disabilities, and including those with cerebral palsy. This will capture the in-work support needs of the individual and empower them to have a confident discussion about adjustments with employers. And it's really important because, of course, all of us want to access work, all of us want to get on with our lives and have our dream careers. So hopefully this package of support will really help people to find their role in the workplace as well. So I'd like to close by again thanking the APPG for inviting me to attend this meeting. We do appreciate all your hard work on supporting patients with cerebral palsy, and we also look forward to further engagement with you to enable all those with cerebral palsy to achieve their full potential and to follow their dreams. And one last thing, quite often when I'm giving these speeches, I'm very conscious that it sounds as though we have a perfect system. And that's because obviously when you're at my level and you're designing these systems, you make sure that you have all the things in place that sound as though they should sensibly join up. However, one of the reasons it's really interesting to come to these events and also to learn from people with direct lived experience is sometimes that doesn't always happen, and that's what I'm also aware of. So it's a continuous improvement to make sure that what we aim for and what we want is actually what is delivered on the ground and how you experience it yourselves. So I look forward to hearing more from you about how well we've done that, or where there are ideas for more focus and improvement. Thank you very much.
I thought we were moving to Mary, but we're not, so I'm now going to extemporize.
He's behind me. No,
Because I haven't even researched who I'm introducing now, because I thought, anyway, it doesn't matter.
No, we've got a few points for the Minister.
I thought we were asking the question at the end, but we can ask it. We can
do questions at the end. It's your meeting, Chair. We can do.
Mary, what would you like to do?
Oh, well, I might not be here at the end because I've got a question.
Yeah,
Mary, as Chair, ask your question.
The whole meeting.
Yeah, I think so. Till 11, I'm here. So about half an hour.
Okay, well, why not? Let's move on until the next speaker. Then there might be a few questions at the end for everybody. So I want to. So thank you, Minister, anyway, for that input. And I think we'll hear a little bit more from you shortly. The next speaker is Mrunal Sisodia, who's co-chair at National Network of Parent Carer Forums. So over to Mrunal.
Good morning, everybody, and again, thank you for having me. I'll try to speak for 5 minutes, and before I do that, I just wanted to share with you, James, you and I have very parallel stories. So I'm the father of very premature twins as well, 24 weeks, and sadly, one of my boys didn't survive, but my other son is now 14 and has many conditions, but also has this phenomenal lust for life, and he's actually genuinely inspirational to me every single day. I've learned more from him than I've learned from anybody else, I think. So yes, but I'm not here to talk about my own personal story. So I'm one of the. I've got the pleasure and the privilege of being one of the co-chairs of the National Network of Parent Carer Forums. So we are a group of, the way I describe it, I sort of channel Lincoln. Gettysburg Address. We are of parents, by parents, for parents. So we are established in pretty much every single local authority area in England, and so 150 branches, and we have a membership of north of 100,000. So we are all parents and carers of children and young people with special education needs or disability, aged between 0 and 25, and we work with government departments, Department for Education, DWP, a little bit with health, a lot with the NHS, and really we exist to co-produce, to tell our stories, to share that lived experience and try to figure out how we can make the commissioning, the policy making, the delivery of services a lot better. So the first thing I want to say is that word cliff edge. It has been mentioned several times before, so I won't. I don't think I need to expand on that anymore. But just the idea, just if you can emote and empathise for a moment, as sometimes parents are criticised for wanting to hang on to education for their young person when education may no longer be the appropriate setting for them, the appropriate next step for them when they reach that school leaving age. But if you can just empathise the parental view, which is that you've actually had something for 14 years before between the ages of 5 and 19, that actually gives your young person a reason to get out of bed each morning and do something purposeful that they hopefully enjoy. And that is going to be taken away from you. And really what happens next is absolutely terrifying for our members. Absolutely terrifying. If you talk to any parent of a child with additional needs, particularly those with the most complex needs, they have two big fears. The first is what happens when they leave school or leave education. The second is what happens when I die. And it's really, really stark. It's like that. Now, let's talk about what should be happening when you transition out of education, because it's quite right that people with additional needs and cerebral palsy should transition out of education. I think that the NDTI, or the National Development Team for Inclusion, have a really phenomenal framework. They've developed this, and for those of you who aren't familiar with that, it talks about education and employment, so something to do during the day, a purpose. It talks about health and well-being. So actually, let's recognise the fact that if you're not healthy, you're very unlikely to be able to do anything else. It talks about being part of the community, and this is really, really critical. Young people are part of a community when they are young people because they go to a school, because they live in a family home, often, usually. That being taken away, where does their community come from? How are they integrated into that community, into the community they live in? And the fourth thing is independent living. Where do they live? And again, James touched on that again earlier. So I think getting those four things right and having a plan for a child that talks about their education or employment, their health and well-being, being part of a community and independent living is what a good transition looks like. Now, the Minister spoke to many of the provisions that are in place, many of the initiatives that are in place that the government has launched, and we've worked with government on many of these. You were also aware enough, Minister, to recognise that actually they don't cut it for many families, and many families still feel as I've described. Now, I think it's really important to unpack why that is, and we've done a lot of work on this in putting into the NHS long-term plan, the SEND Green Paper, and also the Children's Social Care Review, about why is it that all of these things, very well-intentioned things that look good on paper, actually, when it comes to the rub, haven't made the difference. And really, we sort of talk about 3 or 4 things. The first is money. We can't get away from the fact that over the last few years, following austerity, the periods of austerity, there just hasn't been the same amount of money in the system to enable some of these activities to work. But I also believe that you could continue to throw money at it. Money alone isn't the answer. There needs to be, it's a big part of the answer that can't be ignored, but there's also other things going on. The next thing that we look at is the accountability and incentivization of leaders, system leaders. If you go and talk to a director of children's services and ask them what keeps them up at night, and we do talk to many of them, they will probably tell you it's safeguarding type issues. If you go and talk to a commissioner in your local ICB and tell them what keeps them up at night, a lot of their concern is actually around older people. Young people with additional needs in cerebral palsy have not been a high priority for a lot of key players in the system. It just hasn't got to the top of a very, very full agenda. And that means that they haven't been incentivized to be inclusive and to reach out in the ways they need to. And then when they haven't done that, the accountability in the system just isn't there to make sure that the families have the right redress and the system has the right redress to do that. And I consciously didn't mention schools there because a lot of this sits, schools similarly face the same incentivization and accountability challenges. But I think that given that we're talking about transition away from school, I think that we won't focus there. The fourth thing we say is that the leaders, managers and staff just aren't equipped and supported to deliver. Very often they don't know the law, so Alex, I'm sure will touch on that. They really haven't made the cultural changes that we need to be made, which is being really, really almost bold and confidently inclusive, aggressively inclusive to make these changes. And then the last thing we talk about is there just isn't enough co-production in the system. And Minister, I was really pleased that you touched on this, because we think that good, real, genuine co-production requires courage but also is transformative. If you look at every single transformative service, it has co-production at the core of it. It has been co-produced with both the individual families and strategically with local groups who represent those families. And just to illustrate, some of the strategic issues, maybe I can ask you, maybe be a little bit playful and ask you all to go away with some questions. So, 2 questions for you. Firstly, go and ask your Director of Children's Services how many children with additional needs and cerebral palsy they have in their local area. Go and ask the same question to the person who's in charge of commissioning children's and young people's commissioning at your ICB. I pretty much guarantee you will get a different answer from both. If your Director of Children's Services and the lead commissioner at your ICB are working off different bases, have different definitions of what cerebral palsy or a child in need or where the thresholds come for their services, if you're talking at that basic level of disconnect between services, it's no mystery at all to me why we can't commission effectively, we can't jointly deliver services effectively, we can't plan services between education, health and care services effectively. The next challenge I'd go and ask you to do is go and talk to your, again, ICB and look at their priorities. ICBs across the country are furiously working up their priorities for the coming 2 to 3 years. Go and ask them what their priorities are. And I pretty much guarantee you that very few of them will have a priority that says the transition for young people with additional needs or even vulnerabilities between childhood and adulthood. And again, this goes to speak to the point that actually this is not, addressing this issue is not beyond the wit of man. What it requires is joined up working between different services that actually, for a number of reasons, just hasn't happened. And somewhere in that, I think Minister used this phrase as well, families and children and young people get lost between the cracks. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrunal. And I will move swiftly on to Alex, who is from, it's IPSEA on my notes, it's IPSEA on my screen. Google told me it stood for Independent Provision of Special Education Advice, as opposed to Strategic Environmental Assessments, as I initially thought and was a bit perplexed by. So Alex, over to you. Let's hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious that we don't have a lot of time, and I know that the Minister has actually already spoken to some of the things that I was going to talk about, which is about the way that the current statutory framework works. So I will try to make sure that I don't repeat that unnecessarily. Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm here on behalf of IPSEA, we usually abbreviate it to. And for those who don't know, we're a national charity and we offer free, independent legal advice and support to try to help get the right education for children and young people with all different kinds of SEND. We advise currently more than about 4,000 parents and carers of children and young people with SEND each year. And that includes, over the last 10 years, around 900 children and young people with cerebral palsy. I note the concern that has been spoken about today of people experiencing a cliff edge in terms of service and provision as they approach and transition into adulthood. These are experiences that the parents and carers who contact us would recognise. And in our experience at IPSEA, where this happens, it's typically the result of a statutory body not following their legal duties under the statutory framework that exists. So that might be education, health and or social care. I'm going to be speaking to a brief overview of what those duties are in England. England's the only jurisdiction that IPSEA works in, so we don't cover the legal framework in Northern Ireland, Scotland or Wales, just to clarify. Under, in particular, the Children and Families Act 2014, where you have a child with a lifelong condition such as cerebral palsy under compulsory school age, and their health professional thinks they have or possibly have special educational needs, they must be brought to the attention of their local authority by that health professional. And then the way the system would work is that, thereafter, any special educational needs that they had would be met either from within the setting that they attend over the course of their childhood into adulthood, and that was called SEN support, or if that isn't enough, then from support provided by an education, health and care plan, an EHC plan. And that education and training support that they receive should be determined based on their individual needs by professional assessment. So that'll be by the school with expert input as necessary if they're receiving SEN support, or it will be through a holistic education, health and social care assessment in the case of an EHC plan. And thereafter, in either case, provision is reviewed regularly. In the case of an EHC plan, that's done on a statutory footing. There's a statutory process, and input from education, health and social care professionals should be provided as necessary whenever that happens. Therefore, the way the framework is designed, by the time a child with a lifelong condition approaches adulthood, their needs should be well understood, especially where they have an education, health and care plan. And as the Minister said, there is a particular focus under the Children and Families Act on preparation for adulthood. So there is an entire chapter of the SEND Code of Practice, Chapter 8, which details the planning and considerations that local authorities and their partners should undertake for children and young people with SEND. But in addition, there are some very specific statutory obligations which work to try to secure a smooth transition into adulthood. So for all children with health conditions, the Minister has spoken about specific NICE guidelines about cerebral palsy. There's also guidelines specifically to deal with the planning of transition into adult health and social care services. And that the key thing it recommends is early transition planning. And for those with EHC plans, that should start no later than year 9, so around 13, 14. In relation to social care, the Care Act has specific provisions to facilitate early assessment of possible care needs as an adult through what's called the Child's Needs Assessment. And the local authority can start that as soon as it would be of benefit to do so for that child. And this can then be treated as an adult social care assessment once the child becomes an adult for the purposes of planning and implementing adult social care provision. But in addition, the Care Act has a mechanism that enables local authorities to continue to provide the social care package they provide under children's social care legislation, even after that child becomes an adult at 18, for as long as it takes for that adult social care package to go into place. And that provision, Section 66 of the Act, was specifically designed to try to avoid that cliff edge. In relation to education, for children receiving SEN support, the SEN Code of Practice has, as I've said, some really clear guidance into what should happen in terms of planning for adulthood. And they also have the benefit of the Children and Families Act up to the age of 25. So they can move into systems where they could receive, for example, an EHC plan if they required that, even as they move into adulthood. If a child has an education, health and care plan, then as they move towards adulthood, there will be specific reviews, statutory reviews taking place at phase transfer. So that's transfers from secondary to post-16 or from post-16 onwards. And from year 9 onwards, those statutory reviews have to include a focus on transition to adulthood, whatever that means for that individual child. And so because education, health and social care should be participating in those processes, you can see that there should be plenty of time for preparation for changes that adulthood may bring. And finally, again, I'm speaking about under the Children and Families Act, local authorities and their statutory partners, which include CCGs, which will be ICBs, have strategic commissioning and review duties. So those are to ensure that the needs of children and young people with SEND in general in their area are well met through proper jointly commissioned education, health and social care provision. So the takeaway is to conclude that under the current statutory framework, children with a lifelong condition such as cerebral palsy shouldn't face a rocky transition into adulthood because the legal system is structured to facilitate not only early identification, but individualized support across their childhood and into their adulthood, and long-term planning for them. And obviously their needs will be known from quite early on. So long-term planning is obviously much more straightforward than perhaps a child who presents suddenly with a condition or a disability or SEN. And that should be both across education, health and social care. So these are duties in addition to the ones that the Minister was describing earlier on. Obviously, this is not the experience for lots of people. And as I've explained, from the work we do at IPSEA, our experience is that where this isn't happening smoothly, it's because there has been a failure across one or maybe more statutory bodies to follow the law. But where the law is being properly applied, then successful and well-planned transitions should be the norm. And where this isn't happening, therefore, it is going to be necessary to challenge those statutory bodies. I hope that that's of use in terms of describing that legal transition framework for you. And thank you very much for having us here today. I think on the final slide, there's just some additional information that was there for anybody who might have people that they assist who want to be signposted to it.
Excellent, thank you, Alex. Now, in our bilocated APPG meeting, I'm not entirely sure how we're going to structure the questions, because I can read at least 3 off the chat, and we can get Mike and Mary again.
Happy to read some out in the chat if that's helpful for people. Also, have people put their hands up as well if they've got any questions, because Mary had a question, I believe, that she wanted to ask the Minister.
It was more, well, actually, it was a question around we've talked about the transition period and that cliff edge. How do you think that the children and families can have the right say in what the transition issues are for them and what they move on to next? We know that there's services that are designed, but it's the young people themselves and their families who would like a bigger say, I guess, in what happens next, because cerebral palsy is it's a condition with varying degrees, and some children might be able to go into employment, others would never go into employment, but that. So what happens with their lives, if you like, next, and how should their voice be heard?
Yeah, it's a very important. You can never hear enough of the voices, right? I think that's one of the things you're always struggling with as a minister, is how you actually get to people who are very much experiencing, the impact of what you've put in legislation, as Alex very clearly set out, and how it actually is delivered. So I think for us, we're very keen to continue to get more and more people involved. Obviously, we have the NHS England's Children and Young People's Transformation, as I talked about. There's 14 pilot sites that are testing new ways of working to better integrate care across health, education and social care. And this includes improving that transition from adult services for those with conditions such as cerebral palsy. So perhaps we'll make sure you've got the details of those 14, but make sure people are aware of those. And co-production is a key principle of the transformation programme, and the voice, and that's like the new thing, as it was, that's the new principle to try and improve what we intend and what actually gets delivered. That's a real important conduit to make sure that the families, their carers, are embedded throughout. So we do have a dedicated, children and young people's voice work stream. And we've also appointed 7 young people to work with us as members of our programme board. So I think it's about looking at those structures and just checking we've populated them correctly, we've got enough people. And of course, we've got the SEND review out at the moment as well, which I expect many people will make sure they get their voices heard. It's a genuine intention, co-production. So, but when you start getting more and more voices involved, obviously you need to always check that you've got the right voices. I think one of the things that's going to make a difference, and it was something that was very much brought up by Mrunal as well, is the ICBs. So, he challenged the question of asking how many, asking the director of children's and local, children's services locally, and then asking your ICB. The whole reason that we're putting much more focus on integration and they will have to all have integrated by the 1st of July. So it's a very new, some areas have had it in trials, but it's quite a new way of working. And we also will have on the ICB, it was something that we agreed to during the passage, to make sure that there was a named lead for learning disability and autism on the integrated care board. So what we're trying to do is to make sure that the voices of those people who have additional needs are very much represented on that board. And I think that will make a massive difference. One of the pieces of legislation we put through earlier this year, which isn't cerebral palsy, but is around Down syndrome, is because there are, very few people actually with Down syndrome, less than 50,000 people, and trying to get the voices heard and prioritised was difficult, which is why we have taken some actions. But I believe that this renewed focus on helping people live the most fulfilled lives, not having this cliff edge, and I think it's very important what Mrunal said. You have a community as part of school, whether that's mainstream or special educational needs. How to keep that sense of purpose, that sense of being part of a community is really important to young people, and it's something I personally am very committed to. I have a nephew with Down syndrome and have a number of relatives who are autistic and have some other physical disabilities. And what happens, you can see it, what happens, and the fears that Mrunal was saying, I think every parent, I completely agree. What's going to happen? How are they going to get supported? Are they ever going to get a job? How will they get accepted into the workplace? And I think that's it's very important. And we know we've got a lot more work to do, which is why you've seen all of these focus of these things put in place to try and help deliver in practice better and better. It'll never be perfect, because nothing ever is, but having that loop to be able to continually improve is really important. And actually groups like this being able to tell us, how we can improve that are also important.
Excellent, thank you. And in the interest of time, I'm going to try and take 3 questions together, which means me reading them out, I'm afraid. Firstly, we have Val Stevenson from UCLH, who's been asking about the ICBs you just mentioned, and how if there are no adult CP services in one ICB, and the GP refers out of area, does the money follow? Her point being that UCLH gets very many out of area referrals, and that means that local patients don't necessarily have to wait longer to see their local specialists. Now, I fear I may be one of those out of area referrals, so my apologies to local residents there. The second question is from Gillian Ingle. I'd like to ask the Minister about continuing healthcare and why it's such a pointless and humiliating exercise for many of us with children with severe and prolonged needs, and why fewer people each year qualify for continuing healthcare. And then lastly, in this 3, a question for the Minister, from Ben Sutcliffe from Caudwell Children. Why is there not a national strategy for cerebral palsy as there is for autism and dementia? And what can you do to help us achieve one?
What was that last question, Paul? Why there isn't a national
strategy for cerebral palsy as for autism and dementia? And what can you do to help us get one?
Okay, I mean, they're very specific questions. So in terms of the national strategy, I've only been involved, in the last 8 months in this job. I think the key thing, actually, from my perspective, I've now looked back at many strategies that have been written, and the most important thing is actually to make sure they get implemented. I've now gone back and looked at the last strategies written in 2010 and 10 years before that, and said, actually, what happened as a result of writing this down? So the most actual important thing is to make sure that the processes that you put in place actually work, and you've got some way of understanding where they're not happening and right of redress. So I know that there's, in public policy terms, there is often a focus on an action plan or strategy, etc. But from my mind, the most important thing is to actually implement some of these changes. And at the Integrated Care Board, if you look at the integration white paper, which I don't expect many of you will have done, but it's a 10-year vision of how we better integrate the things that we're talking about here, which is local authorities, the NHS and other, both third party, voluntary and other local services as well. And it goes back to the question Julian asked as well about continuing healthcare. The reason people have these experiences where they're going from past to pillar to post, or they're arguing with different parts of the system, is because they're different budget lines, they're different, and they're trying to basically protect the budget lines. I saw it as in my bid to become a local MP, turn myself from a business person to an MP. I became a councillor for a couple of years at Chichester, and I saw it happen a lot. And in between these two big arguments that were happening about whose budget somebody should land on was a family or a poor person who was just trying to get some help. So I think that is an important part of what we expect the integration to help with. Now, I'm also very aware that this is something that's been tried in several forms before. I think one of the things that has helped us, though, is during the pandemic, we did have a huge focus, because we had to just focus on putting things in place in a different way on integration. And we did put a better care fund in place, which helped those areas work together. So we have got a lot of really good examples. And actually one of the positives, there's not many positives, but one of the things that did come out of the pandemic was that better focus. Because actually, going back to money, if you put all the cash together and you made sensible decisions, you probably wouldn't find that you had difficulty in terms of making the resources go round. What happens is we obviously need to make sure that the money's spent wisely, and you don't spend half the time arguing over whose actually budget something should be on. So the place to fix that will be over that 10-year plan for integration.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we will go for our final comment to our dear leader, Amanda Richardson, who I think has a few comments to make if she'd like to make them, then we will wrap up the meeting. And you're still on mute, Amanda.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yeah, I really fantastic speakers. Everybody has had made such a huge contribution in their own way. And thank you very much, Minister, for coming and hearing this, because as I mentioned in the chat, I do feel that cerebral palsy is often a very underrepresented condition out there. There are rightly very strong and passionate voices from other conditions. And so we do need to, I believe, really need to bang the drum for this community more than we have done it in the past. I just would like to very quickly pull together some of the themes which we have been hearing across these meetings, these APPG meetings on cerebral palsy. We constantly hear about the lack of a joined up approach, the lack of national pathways, too much variation, the lack of teeth in the legislation, or the lack of poor implementation of legislation that we've already got. And we did have a very good Children and Families Act, but unfortunately we all know the issues of implementation of those actually very good and very aspirational aims in that act. I would just like to say a couple of things really that have come out for us from our community and listening to our young people and families with cerebral palsy, is this need for early planning for transition and how alone a lot of our families feel. And I think one of the things that has come through in terms of a very practical way to support families is this a sense of a lead professional, someone that really gets it, that can be in place from very early on in that process, those year 8, year 9 review meetings, that can really start to pull together what is required for a successful transition. Then also looking at what are those options for those young people, real choices of occupation, not necessarily into university and employment where that is possible, but absolutely making sure that those pathways are there for those young people, but for those whose pathways perhaps aren't going to take them to university and employment. So to make sure there are absolutely purposeful occupations available and the systems there to to support them and the flexibility that they will require. But underpinning all of this is, in my opinion, the workforce, and making sure that we have those experts in the system, as everyone has said. None of these aspirational plans will be implemented until we have sufficient resources in the workforce to do it. Please, 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 can we focus on that? Because that underlines for us, I think, what success would be for these families, is to have those people there in place, the knowledge of the very specific requirements and needs of people with cerebral palsy, the therapists, the teachers, the local authority personnel with the knowledge and skills to be compassionate but knowledgeable about the condition, and make sure that our young people have the right start to life, and those plans are in place early. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed, Amanda. Appreciate those comments. As we're now past 11 o'clock, I will start to draw this to a close, unless Mary has anything she would like to add as a personal reflection.
Thanks for that, Paul. Yeah, I was in a similar position with my daughter, say 10 years ago, with this cliff edge and the transition period. And so some of those things that have been mentioned today, some of the questions that the parents and carers have been asking, have been, similar thoughts that were going through my mind, and the absolute horror of thinking what happens next when Maria was finished school. And she actually probably stayed in school too long, because it was that safety net of being somewhere in school. So I'm hoping that was 10 years ago, that, things might have moved on a bit since then. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay. And actually, Maria wouldn't have been. She wouldn't have worked. Maria wouldn't have been worked, and that's why I mentioned before, there's those other activities in life, and that if your child isn't going to get into employment, then you have to make sure that they live a life with dignity and worth, and they're able to do everyday activities that like James' children are doing. But brilliant, lovely. It's been a great discussion today, and let's hope that the SAND paper comes along, the review, and comes along, and we see some action come out of that.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, both to the Minister and indeed to all our other speakers for taking time out of their busy schedules to come and speak to us today and add to both our knowledge and our thinking on the wider issue of transitioning to adulthood. The inquiry goes on and the evidence taking goes on until the 15th of July, and we will be back for the next APPG session, it says here, in the autumn, which is a horrible thought. September the 6th is regarded as being autumn. So enjoy your summer whilst you can, because it will soon be over. So I look forward to seeing you all in September, and enjoy the rest of the sunshine today. Bye bye now.
Bye.